So Arya, now you're this global brand. I mean, let's fast forward, and you're in so many different countries. I think I read somewhere that you're in 80 countries. I
Hmm.
know you do a lot of business overseas. Uh, what do you see the difference between the markets that are overseas, like in Asia and India, versus North America? You have a very unique perspective on the aesthetic
Hmm.
world.
Hmm.
Do you
That's a
see
great
differences?
question. When we first started, fillers in Canada and the US were very kind of new. But at that point, they'd already been in Europe and other markets for 5 to 10 years, HA fillers in particular. So there was always wider acceptance of these products in European countries, Middle Eastern countries, which is interesting because I always find the countries that are more male dominated, the women tend to spend. This was back in the day. The women tended to spend more on their face, like Middle Eastern countries. The amount that women spent in like Saudi Arabia, in Iran, and in these places would dwarf, what people were spending here. So when we started, we were selling in those places because the demand was high. So we really didn't start properly selling in Canada until 2010, 2011. That was after we built our factory and we had our own product here. But it took a while to get to this point. But if it wasn't for the international market, we wouldn't have been able to build our facility here. So to answer your question, there was more acceptance in those countries at the beginning. Also, the definition of beauty in a lot of those places was that more is better. So, if you go to some of these places, they want to be plumped up. And so they were using more product. Whereas in North America back then, it was, Canadians in particular, very conservative. They wanted subtle. And fillers were kind of only being used in nasolabial fill lines. They weren't really using them for contouring and those things back then. So the market here was limited. But now it's changing. So we've seen, huge growth in Canada and the US where people are starting to do those things that they've been doing in other places. And there's more acceptance. People talk about the treatments. They're on social media, saying what they got done. Whereas when I started, it was a big secret if you got anything done. You wouldn't talk about it. But in a lot of these other countries, when you got something done, everybody knew you got something done because you went big or you didn't do it. But so here, I think people are starting, and I'm sure you're noticing this in your practice. I think people are more aware and they're more open to, admitting they've had things done or being open to talking about it with other people,
Yeah.
whereas it wasn't always the case.
Do you see that there are global influences? I guess my question is, my sense is that the North American market, maybe this is just my bias being in North America, but that the North American market drives a lot of the standards and what's happening. Is that true, or do you think that these are
Um,
all happening regionally and they're irrespective of one another?
so I think there's hotspots for beauty in the world. I mean, France has always kind of been one of the leaders in terms of in beauty. And I think French women generally, if you go back, they've kind of been trailblazers in a lot of things. Um, so that's been one hotspot. I think one of the emerging hotspots now is South Korea. We're seeing a huge number of new South Korean biotech companies and beauty companies. I think in South Korea, there's 10 different neurotoxins that are made in South Korea. There's filler companies, there's cosmetics companies there that we don't. Unfortunately, in Canada and the U.S., the government doesn't really support these types of industries here, whereas there it's become like a policy point for the government to push these industries. So that's definitely become a huge hotspot for this industry. The U.S., because of the regulatory hurdles and the amount of time that it takes to get to market, they usually are late adopters of technology. So Restylane was in Canada 4 or 5 years before it got to the States. And that's just because the FDA is very difficult compared to other regulatory bodies. The thing about the US is that the physicians and the country is so highly respected that once doctors in the US start doing things, they catch on in other places as well. But yeah, definitely, there's hotspots for beauty. Unfortunately, Canada hasn't really been one of them. And I think in North America, we're the only HA manufacturer in all of North America that produces in North America.